Education, Annie Sleece, who will introduce our presenter.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. So I am the Director of Advocacy and Education, and I have the great privilege of introducing you to our speaker today. But first, I wanted to mention a couple of things. First of all, this will be an interactive presentation, and if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and we will do our best to respond. I'm sure LaWanda will love to hear from you too. I'm speaking for you, LaWanda. I hope that's okay. And we also just want to remind you that you're not alone. This is a difficult time, and what we're talking about today, it may generate strong feelings that might come out of nowhere or surprise you, and we want to make sure that you know how to access crisis support should you need it. And there are ways to do that. There is a national crisis text line that's available 24/7 no matter where you are. You can text the state Delaware, DE, to 741-741, or you can access the Delaware Hope Line, which you can do by calling or by texting. So the phone number is 1-833-9-HOPE-DE, or you can text DE HOPE to 55753. Now, I do want to share a brief bio of LaWanda, but she didn't add the most exciting thing that we've just shared this week, which is LaWanda is Nami Delaware 2020 Education Champion of the Year. So that is not part of the bio I'm going to share with you, but I do want you all to know that. And you might have seen that slide popping up a moment ago. So LaWanda Burgoyne is the co-leader of Delaware's SEL Collaborative, and she currently serves as a Supervisor of Student Services for Capital School District. She has worked for 13 years, strategically implementing school improvement initiatives to support the positive social, emotional, behavioral, and academic learning of all students. As a high school English teacher, literacy coach, and district administrator, LaWanda has used her experience in collaborative problem solving, systems improvement, and educational leadership to assist teams in improving school climate and student success. Her work continues to focus on building equitable educational access and opportunity, providing supports and services for students across the district. LaWanda is a certified facilitator of youth mental health first aid and of Nami's Ending the Silence and Nami Basics, and she holds an MS in education from Walden University. Welcome, LaWanda.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Annie. All right, with everyone's patience, I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation screen. So glad to be here with everyone this afternoon. All right. So as Annie shared, I have been in education for about 13 years now. What drew me to Nami about 3 years ago is I am actually a parent with lived experience with a child who has a diagnosed mental health disorder. Luckily, I have a wonderful job where I am able to take what I've learned in my personal life and what I'm able to do with Nami and apply it right to our students here in Capital School District and across the state of Delaware, which is a fantastic opportunity. Again, please use the chat. If anything comes up, you have any questions as we are going through, I'd love for this to be as interactive as possible. I can't see anyone's face, so I'm going to rely on my moderator, Amanda, to help me out in case there is anything that comes up, and she'll share those questions as we go through. We are going to do 2 polls because I would like to know, now that I've introduced myself, if you would like to introduce yourselves. If I can get this. All right, just go ahead and answer the poll. So what is your role in supporting youth mental health or engaging with youth? Okay, I feel like most people have had a chance to respond now, so I'm going to go ahead and end the polling, but hopefully you guys can all see that as well. We're about 10% parent family member, 6% school professionals, 71% clinical professionals, and 13% other. Thank you for, oh, there we go. I can hit share results. Learn something new every day. Okay, thank you all for that. So given that we do have quite a few of you who are clinical professionals, this is going to be really relevant, and hopefully a lot of the things that you hear are going to resonate with you, and you may actually say, wow, I didn't realize that was actually social emotional learning. So we're going to dig right into what is social emotional learning. Hopefully many of you have already seen this graphic in the past. This is what we call the castle wheel. Social emotional learning, I won't read the definition to you, is basically all of those soft skills that we've called a lot of different things over the years. You know, we had character education, character development, you know, workforce skills. So we went from sort of the preschool skills that you needed to be able to come into class and sit next to your neighbor without hitting them when you got upset, all the way to showing up to work on time, which we really focused on in K-12 education or youth development. Those have all been bundled together now, and they're called social emotional learning. The great thing about social emotional learning is it never stops, and they are all codependent on each other. That makes it really difficult for us to parse things out and say, oh, it's this one specific skill in this one specific time. But one of the things that we've done as the Delaware SEL Collaborative is have tried to outline those competencies in each of these areas. So self-awareness, that's a huge competency area. And so we said, all right, there are some specific sub-skills within that that are important. Here's what they look like, K-2. Here's what they should look like as adults. So that document is available, and it's actually at the end of this slide, and or at the end of this slideshow, and I'll share it with everyone in case you want to really dig into what all of those are. But what's important to recognize in this wheel is these are all interconnected, and they don't just happen through explicit instruction, but they're also supported throughout the school-wide practices, and they're also supported in family and community partnerships. So youth mental health, just in case we have some folks in here who don't know the numbers, why do we think it's really important that we look at social emotional development and at youth mental health? Well, because mental health is there for all of us. It's a spectrum. Some days I'm really mentally healthy and my social emotional skills are on point, and some days I struggle a little more, and that's as an adult. And so it's really important for us as we're engaging with youth, especially youth who might be experiencing some kind of a mental health challenge or might be having signs and symptoms of a mental health condition, that we also keep in mind, where are they in their social emotional development? It's really important for us also to remember that 1 in 5 people live with a mental health condition, and 50% of those conditions have an onset by age 14. The youth we work with are at a critical juncture, and it's really important that we engage with them in a constructive way. And we also remember that they are youth. They're still children and they're still developing. So what is that connection? It's the heart and the brain. Here's what we now know about the brain. The brain isn't fully developed until age 25 or so. So that's a range, right? It depends on the person, it depends on the experiences they've had, and that's not considering if there were any developmental delays, if there's been trauma that's impacted the brain's development. Just a typical developing young adult isn't considered to be fully developed until age 25 or so. And the adult brain and the teen brain interact differently. They think differently. Anyone who's ever interacted with a teenager knows this on some level. The way that they see the world is different. But research on brains has actually proven to us that adults think with their prefrontal cortex. This is the long-range planning. This is the consequence part of the brain. Teens, they think with their amygdala, the emotional part of their brain. That is how they think and that is how they react, and they need support in order to shift that thinking and to have time for that prefrontal cortex to really develop as they move through life. So it's important for us to remember when we're working with youth who are experiencing any kind of a mental health issue or crisis, that they don't have access to the same brain that we as adults have access to. They don't have access to the same social emotional skills that we as adults do. And we also have to remember our own social emotional wellness when we're thinking about and interacting with our youth. I'm going to jump into, so each of these slides, I take those 5 competency areas that you remember from that wheel. I outline what are those SEL skills, and then what are some things we need to think about as we are adults working with youth, especially in the area of mental health. So the basic SEL skill areas in self-awareness are: we have to recognize emotions, identify our own qualities and interests, classify our own strengths and weaknesses, and take personal responsibility. That's huge. You think self-awareness, well, that's just, oh, I recognize I feel a little nervous because I'm doing this presentation. But it's also about understanding I have certain strengths, but I also have certain areas of opportunity. It's also understanding that I tend to be a very strong-willed person. That's a quality I have, but it's also something I need to then, when we shift into social awareness, be aware of as I interact with others. So those are the social emotional skills. So what does that mean when we start talking about working with youth? First of all, it's really important that we validate the range of emotions that youth experience. One of the things that we teach in youth mental health first aid is that it is important that we recognize, that we listen non-judgmentally, and that we give reassurance and information. That doesn't mean that we give advice, which is sometimes hard for us as adults, but it does mean that we say, you know what? A lot of teens feel extreme emotions. It's true. In that development of that brain, when they're living in that amygdala, extreme tends to be the way that emotions are, either extremely happy or extremely sad or extremely bored, depending on who the individual is and where you are. It's also important, thinking about self-awareness, that we allow the youth choice in their response and in their treatment. Knowing I have a lot of clinicians listening to this, I'm sure that you can identify with that. Prescribing one set of treatment for someone is not always effective if they don't have choice in it. Allowing those students to recognize their own qualities and their own interests, what is going to give them the reassurance that they need to be successful, is really, really important. And the most important thing, I think, over all of this is to remember that development is a range. Youth in crisis today may not have the same ability to recognize their emotions that they did yesterday. So just like every day is a day by day, every day is a new day, we have to remember that sometimes in that crisis moment, they're really living in that center of the brain in the fight or flight, and they don't have the ability to recognize, name, and communicate their own emotions. All right. Self-management. So there's 2 main areas in self-management. That's a little bit misleading, because as we know, self-awareness, knowing that I feel angry, is one thing. Having the ability to manage myself, to not lash out when I feel angry, is a whole different ballgame, right? So they're interconnected, but self-management is a huge portion that many of our youth really have a hard time with when they don't have good models. So the SEL skills are manage emotions and behavior constructively. That seems really simple. There are a lot of benchmarks and performance indicators underneath that. For instance, just in the range of 9 to 12, the ability to reframe difficult situations into opportunities. That actually falls under managing emotions and behavior constructively. Evaluating how thoughts and emotions affect decision-making. Recognizing that thought, feeling, behavior chain is really important, and not something that a youth is going to do on their own without explicit instruction and reinforcement, so that we're consistently saying, okay, you felt this way, you thought this thing, then you did this action. Where could we have intervened and done something different? Understanding the effect of self-monitoring and self-talk strategies. So You know, again, a lot of these are almost clinical words. And when I really dug into this and was thinking about it, things like reframing difficult situations, using self-talk strategies, these are things that are used in mental health to help support active recovery. And they're also explicit social emotional skills. Anyone can benefit from the ability to take what looks like on the outside a really bad situation and go, okay, what can I learn from this? How can I move forward from it? And then practicing strategies for coping. I know Annie mentioned at the beginning, but I think it serves restating here. This is a tough time for everyone. It may not be a tough time for everyone every day, but I know sometimes the gravity of the situation we live in COVID, the needs of the students and the families who attend my district, the isolation of my own children doing virtual school right now really weighs heavily on me. So making sure that we're working with ourselves and modeling good practices and then sharing the ability to use those practices with the youth we work with is really important. So to me, self-management is a lot of, as we give that reassurance and information to youth who may be either in a mental health crisis or just, you know, having some signs and symptoms and really having a difficult time managing their own mental wellness. It's important for us to remember it's not about you, meaning it's not about me. As the adult, as the non-youth, youth often come to us in crisis. They will engage in inappropriate relations. They will yell and scream at a teacher who didn't do anything to them. They may, you know, shut down and be angry and say, you know, I don't trust you. I don't like you. I'm not going to engage in counseling, whatever it may be. But ultimately, that is an outpouring of their own angst and anxiety and concern and just lack of well-being. And very rarely does it have anything to do with us as an adult. We want to model positive self-talk. I know I have days where I feel like I have just messed up absolutely everything I've done, and I could go home and perseverate on that. But you know, engaging with the youth in my own life, I think it's really important that we model that positive self-talk and say, again, this is about reframing, right? Ooh, I had this really bad encounter today. I think I handled it badly, but here's what I'm going to do differently in the future, or here's where I can mend that relationship. You know. And then again, focusing on small choices and goals. That goes to the set, monitor, and adapt goals. I think we as a society perhaps, but definitely in K-12 education, moved away from helping students plan for all the things that have to be planned for. And so I'm really excited that moving back towards a focus on social emotional learning, we have a lot more explicit focus on goal setting. What do you like to do? What do you want to do? What choices can you make now to help you get to that goal? You know, we often have students say, oh, I want to be a professional football player. That's a great dream. So what does it take to do that? What kind of a college do you need to attend if you don't get picked right out of high school, right? So there's a lot of steps there and we can help support them. But certainly a student who is experiencing a mental health crisis, we're not talking about a goal of, I want to be a football player. We're talking about a goal of, you know, I want to see tomorrow. I want to be happier. You know, I want my parents to understand me. So often working in those roles, supporting our youth, it's really important that we help them say, okay, so what's the one thing we could do now to move toward that goal? Don't forget, you are welcome to throw a question in the chat if you have one. All right, social awareness. So we talked about self, right? So we've got internal and external. My self-awareness, self-management, how do we help and think about students where they are developmentally as we're trying to help them through whatever mental health issues they're having. So social awareness is about recognizing others. This is where I would encourage us as adults to really focus on ourselves and the kind of care and support that we are providing. SEL skills recognize others' emotions, exhibit civic responsibility, and have respect for human dignity, including culture and differences. I think most of us can agree right now, society is having a hard time with this. So it's important that we model it and that we are aware cultural differences or just, any other differences don't mean wrong. And in the moment, it's about being aware and being responsive to someone's culture and someone's differences and someone's needs without being condescending or judgmental. So what are the things that we can focus on in providing youth mental health? Listening patiently and non-judgmentally. I really thought about doing a poll here to see how many of you would also agree with me that you're kind of a fixer. When someone comes to me with a problem, I immediately want to give advice and tell them what they should do and how they should make it better. So I have to really reel myself in when I have someone sharing with me that they are in some kind of a difficult situation or they're feeling unhappy, to really just listen patiently and non-judgmentally and see if there's reassurance and information that I can give. I have an almost 14-year-old at home, and on most days she's okay with virtual learning, and then some days she just has a really bad day and she feels like no one likes her and she's just excluded from the world, and this is the way the world's going to be forever. So just listening to her and giving her reassurance that, you know what, those emotions are valid. I think we all feel lonely sometimes right now. And then asking, so what would you like to do about it? Giving those limited choices, right? Not saying, did you reach out to this friend? Did you reach out to that friend? Have you tried going for a walk? That's my advice side. I try not to do that, but just offering information of, well, sometimes when I'm feeling blue, I like to take the dogs for a walk. Sometimes being outside makes me feel better, right? So have you considered that? Or just asking the question directly, do you feel like you need to talk to someone about that? Because in my house now, after all I have learned, it's really okay to talk about mental health. As a matter of fact, it's not okay not to talk about mental health. So always the question comes back to, is this something that we can work on, or is this something you really want to talk to somebody about? And there's no stigma and no blame in that. I will tell you, that was not the household necessarily that my older children grew up in. We weren't really judgmental, but now that we know better, we do better. And we have those open conversations. Encourage positive social interactions. So I'm going to go back to my daughter and her experience, right? More time on Snapchat is not a good answer necessarily for an almost 14-year-old, but encouraging her to reach out to her grandma who she hasn't talked to in a little while, or write a letter to a pen pal, or just get some time outside with the animals is always a potential good thing. And finally, we want to normalize the conversation. So I talked about this kind of with my example in my family. And please understand, this does not mean it is something that I have been able to get all of my family to buy into. I have elderly parents who still sometimes want to know, for my older child and their diagnosis, well, can't she just grow up? Can't she just snap out of that? No, she can't, and she won't. But she is living in recovery and she is successful. And I am super thankful for the experiences that I've had with her and the fact that she is very open and very willing to talk to others about her experiences. So we normalize the conversation in my home. We normalize the conversation in my office. And we just hope that more people can do that and understand it's part of the social emotional development. We also want to be really cognizant of the fact that culture, societal expectations, and biases impact the way that we think as human beings, and they impact the way that the youth think. There are some messages that they have received since birth that are going to impact the way that they look at things. And so one of the most powerful strategies that we have is really to engage with those youth in thinking about the different influences on their thought patterns and how they can first be more open and accepting themselves, but then also spread that to their peers. It's amazing the power that kids have with each other. All right. Relationship skills. So once we're aware of others, then we have to work on our relationship skills. For students, this is where, or for youth, and again, it goes all the way to adult, right? We want to learn how to interact effectively with others, develop and maintain positive relationships, and prevent, manage, and or resolve interpersonal conflict. In this particular competency area, it's really important to remember the role you fill with the youth. You know, I have a different role with my children. I am their mom. I have a different level of privacy and confidentiality that I maintain with them. But in my professional role, when I am working with a youth, I do need to remember I'm a mandatory reporter, and any interaction I have with the student or youth, I need to make sure that they understand I have an obligation to their physical safety. And so things that they share with me may not be maintained confidentially. That's a really hard conversation to have. Hopefully you have a strong relationship already, but we also need to remember we're not always the right person to have that conversation with that youth. Sometimes the best thing we can do in the role that we're in trying to support youth mental health is to say, wow, this is a really complex situation you're telling me about. I'm here for you. I'm going to stay with you, but I think we need to involve professionals. So again, you'll notice just in what I said there, I'm modeling I statements. I am concerned about you. I'm hearing you say, this is the way you feel. I see that you haven't been as engaged lately. I'm concerned about you, right? This is not, again, about back in my old advice hat, you have symptoms of depression. You need to go see a professional, right? That's not my role. Even as mom or professional, because I'm a school person, not a clinician, right? I think it's really important that we all try to use those I statements as much as possible. We also need to model actively de-escalating, diffusing, and resolving. So let's talk for just a minute about crisis. In a crisis situation, that youth is firmly in that amygdala. They are fight, flight, or freeze. They aren't rationalizing anything. The most effective thing we can do as someone who's supporting youth mental health is help them de-escalate and regulate before we worry about engaging in any of those higher level thinking. Do you want to do this or this? I'm going to give you limited choice. First of all, we just have to make sure that they are de-escalated and regulated. And then again, maintain integrity to your role. It's also really important here to also normalize. I think, well, I won't cast any blame, but I think there's a societal expectation that if you're in a good relationship, you're never going to experience conflict. I think our students, our youth see a lot of different models of unhealthy relationships, and they have this Disney-fied version of healthy relationships. And those are everything is great, everybody agrees with each other, and there's never any conflict. And it's really important that we just acknowledge that conflict is natural. Having two people who always think the same way would quite frankly be a little frightening. We always have people who see things differently. People see things through their lens. They come in with their background. So it's working through that process where we can grow together and reach a resolution. But we want to make sure we normalize the fact that conflict happens. But conflict doesn't have to mean, doesn't end up in physical altercations, and conflict doesn't mean you're no longer my friend and we're done. I never want anything to do with you. Conflict can be constructive, and it's really important that we help them see that. And the final SEL competency area is responsible decision making. So we hope by the time our students leave our schools and become young adults in college, They'll be able to use multiple factors in decision-making, including ethical, safety, responsibility, and goals, and deal responsibly with academic and social situations. Ultimately, at least here in Capital, we often talk about meeting the needs of the whole child. We want to help by meeting the needs of the whole child, then become a whole adult who can live a constructive and productive life and be, have that civic responsibility that we would hope people have. So thinking about the mental health connection, it's again important that we model good strategies. Simple, stop, think, and act. So responsible decision-making assumes that there's some thought going into decision-making. Go back to the brain again. If youth are living in the amygdala, they are impulsive. If there's any word that explains teenagers, it's impulsive. It's why they steal a car, drink mom and dad's alcohol, sneak out at night. Those are all things we would sometimes consider typical teen behavior, but we also know that those are really dangerous things that can lead them down a very slippery slope. So we want to make sure that we are modeling, just stop. If you want to do something, let's stop and think about what the consequences of that thing might be. Definitely important. And then acknowledge the challenge of being responsible while not in charge. I've heard this over and over. Before I, again, came to this current position that I'm in, I did teach high school English. And high school has to be about the most miserable place sometimes for kiddos to be, because we put a lot of expectations on them, a lot of responsibility, and then we don't give them a lot of choice or a lot of personal authority. With good reason, because again, they're not thinking up here, but it's really challenging to be told you have to go here, you have to do this, and then you're also responsible for this. And in many cases, a lot of our youth are caring for younger siblings or other family members. They often have many responsibilities beyond what we would think of as traditional youth responsibilities, and that can be hard. And finally, in responsible decision-making, we really want to embody empathy, not sympathy or pity. Hopefully, most of you have seen Brené Brown, and I was going to put it in here, but I did not. The idea is, if she has a great analogy she uses, that if someone is in a hole and you lean over and you go, gosh, sorry you're in the hole, right? That's sympathy or pity. Wow, sorry you're down there. Even throwing down a rope. Empathy literally is getting in the hole with them and saying, wow, it's really dark in here. And making sure that we're thoughtful, but also not condescending, which is another challenge that we have quite frequently working with youth. So I saw there was actually a question in the chat about helping youth regulate those impulses. So that's a whole other area of behavior science, and I love brain research and I love behavior science, but there are a lot of, I would say, trauma-informed practices which actually help students, but I'm going to refrain from answering that because I am not a behavior analyst, and say that definitely do a search on trauma-informed practices and regulation, because helping youth learn to regulate those impulses is a huge field of study, and certainly way more time than I have here. Great question, though. That's like the age-old question. In schools, if we could figure that one out perfectly, it'd be great. All right. So I promised to share some resources besides sort of the tidbits that I gave, and this presentation will be made available. It is being recorded. And I also have down at the bottom, you'll see I've given you a bit.ly link where you can go and just download the PDFs of the presentation. So some of the resources you have on here, there's the Delaware SEL competencies. There's an entire document that the state has put out that explains the competencies, the benchmarks, the performance indicators, and it also explains how we expect those competencies, the SEL competencies, to be used in schools, to be used by families, and really how it connects with all of the other things I've sort of hit on today. Equity, right? Cultural responsiveness, trauma-informed, and then in our schools, multi-tiered systems of support. We believe social emotional learning is one of those tier 1 strategies. That means every kid should get it. There's nothing about social emotional learning that should not be explicitly taught and reinforced in schools for students. It's not about morals, right? It's not about judgment, and it's not even really about character. It's about the actual social emotional skills. So what do you have in your toolkit, and what could you use some help strengthening a little bit in your toolkit so that you can be more successful? More information on SEL is available at the CASEL website for home and community. The Collaborative of Academic Social Emotional Learning is a fantastic national resource, and Delaware is one of their collaborating states. They provide us fantastic technical assistance and resources. I used Anchorage School District here as an example for you because I think they have actually been working with CASEL for several years now, and they have some fantastic resources for community members and for family members on how to implement SEL practices within your home or within your setting outside of school. Pure Edge and Empatico are actually both some vendors that have some free mindfulness activities, social emotional learning activities that you can use. Again, you can apply it across multiple settings. And then again, this presentation is on that bit.ly. So it's time for me to stop talking for a few minutes and take any questions that you guys might have. Please type them into the chat.
Great, thank you so much, LaWanda. That was a wonderful presentation. Like she said, please put any questions you have in the chat box so that we can get to them. I did get a couple privately, so I'll ask those while people may be typing. The first is, how can we encourage this at home? So not just in schools, but so that children are getting this both in school and outside of school.
So that's a fantastic question. The first thing that I would encourage families to do is find out from your school, what is the social emotional program or framework that the school is using. While we have the competencies out there, they weren't really written for families, and they certainly weren't written for students. They are written very much for an education lens. So what we often have happen is the school will implement a specific program or a series of lessons that has its own language. I'll give you a couple of examples. Some schools in Delaware are using Leader in Me as an SEL framework. So it actually it's the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People that has been modified to be a curriculum for elementary school. So that language matters because it is these SEL skills, but it's put into those 7 habits. Things like put first things first, sharpen the saw. Sharpen the saw is really all about self-care. So recognizing your own needs, recognizing when maybe your emotional bank is a little low and you need to take some time to sort of refocus yourself. So find out what the language is. Lion's Quest is another SEL framework that is used in some schools. And again, it's not to say that there's one good one or that they have to have a specific framework, but find out from your school what is the language they're using, what are the expectations they have, and then work individually with the teachers or the grade level or the principal to find out, how do we reinforce that at home? One of the most powerful things you can do is simply make sure you're using the same language, so kids aren't getting confused as we're using different language, different terminology for basically the same thing as we go through, and as they develop.
Great, thank you. We just had one come in the chat box that says, with someone with a mental health diagnosis, what can we as clinicians help kids who are already challenged? I guess, what can we do as clinicians to help kids who are already challenged with a mental health diagnosis?
Right. So I think the most important thing that clinicians can do first is understand developmentally where a typical student might be. And then only to understand where are the deficits that particular student might struggle with. Again, I am not a clinician, but I do know from lived experience that someone who has a personality disorder may have the responsible decision-making skills of a 21-year-old one day and may have the decision-making skills of a 12-year-old the next day. So just being cognizant of that shift and then helping that individual understand that difference themselves. There's a lot in here that I didn't even touch on about youth taking ownership for their own development. Ultimately, we want them all to be responsible, own their own decisions, be their own advocate. So helping them understand, in their moments of crisis or on a bad day, they may revert to some of those past practices, but really, here's where we need to be. So how can we help you bridge that gap? And what supports can we put in place so that you are both cognizant of those things, but also don't feel completely overwhelmed, right? That's one of the things with the competencies that we really struggled with as a team. The collaborative includes, after school providers and community organizations and parents. So we tried to get a really broad range of people to come together around the competencies. We wanted to make sure explicitly they weren't another set of accountability measures that kids, parents, and schools would feel like we were failing to meet up to. Instead, it's a broad range and understanding that here's what we want to move toward, but some days we may not be as close as others.
Great, thank you. We had another question. How do you suggest, or do you suggest rewarding when they kind of meet these competencies, or they do something that, shows that they are using their social emotional learning skills? Do you suggest reward, and if so, what kinds?
Ooh, that's a great question. So I am a PBIS person, so positive behavior interventions and supports, and because it works. I mentioned behavior science a little bit earlier. Again, I'm not an expert in that area, but I'm going to tell you one of the things that we know works is behavior specific praise. So when, I'll go back to my 13-year-old, right? So there's an expectation because she has a 2-hour break in the day. She's virtual in the morning, virtual in the afternoon. She has a 2-hour break in the day. When she does what I expect her to do, which is empty the dishwasher, without having to be reminded, I just very specifically say, Gwen, I really appreciated that you were responsible and remembered your responsibility today, your chore or whatever. And that really shows that you are growing. Right? So it's not about blame and it's not about shame. It's about we reward that appropriate behavior, which if they have those social emotional skills, right? So if she can recognize, wow, I really don't want to go down there, but I'm going to self-manage myself and make the right decision because there is an expectation in my family that I have a civic role. Maybe that's blowing it out of proportion, but it's a really simple example, but we want to make sure that that's acknowledged. And that, again, when you're talking about youth saying, I know you didn't want to do this. I know this wasn't the first thing on your plate today, but you did it. And that added to the good of our family. It meant I didn't have to put away dishes when I came home from work. I really appreciate that. That's really mature of you. It's little things like that, and it does sound a little condescending when I say it like this. I promise when I say it to my 13-year-old, I don't sound like that. But it's retraining us because as adults, we probably got one of two responses. Either our parents didn't mention that we did it, or they only mentioned it when we didn't do it, or they were like, oh, thanks. So that's where behavior specific praise matters. It's about saying this one thing was tied to all of those skills and you did it and did it well.
Great. And so the last question I have, and so if anyone else has any, make sure to put them in the chat box before we wrap up here. With this back and forth between virtual learning, or sometimes just children will be in virtual learning for a while, how do you suggest, or do you have any strategies to, really encourage social emotional learning while being disconnected over the computer?
Right. So that's a really hard one. And a lot of people are struggling. So at home, I suggest that families think about ways to build back in some traditional structures that maybe have gone by the wayside. We've built back in, and this is not for everybody, but we've built back in family dinners. And we actually went out over the weekend and we got a 1,000-piece puzzle, and it's now on the dining room table. So I don't know how we're going to do family dinners, but building in time to make those connections is really important. Now, obviously in schools, we're encouraging a lot of different ways that teachers are amazing in the ways they're reaching out to students, sending them individualized messages, allowing them to, put their profile picture up, having a different kind of almost show and tell, of put up a picture of your favorite animal, or just connecting. That human connection is really important. And while it's difficult in the virtual setting, it is possible. And then, I would say that just encouraging students to reach out to each other. They don't call each other. Youth don't talk on the phone these days. So saying, that's okay, but have you, would you FaceTime with your grandma? Because I think there's that whole other generation of people who all of a sudden are finding that technology is really, really important, right? So FaceTime with grandma, show grandma something new, show grandma how you can put video effects on Zoom. Finding those opportunities to reach out and to connect is important now. Just remembering it could be a revert to what was traditional, but it also might be doing something totally different that is outside of the norm. One of the other things is just get out of bed. I don't know if anybody else had this. I know I had this in my own family. It felt like it was a huge hurdle to try to get my 13-year-old out of bed in the spring. She was one of those who, this was the first year she was going to play soccer, and then she got 2 weeks of practice and we were done. She's a kid who's a drama kid and a chorus kid and very, very social, and all of that was just gone. So finding ways to interact differently and finding ways for her to still do things with her friends virtually or social distanced. I can't underscore how important going outside is for my family, to take walks, just to get out in nature, especially while the weather's nice and cool. So those are some of the things that I would recommend.
Great. Well, I think that's all of the questions that we had come in through the chat. If anyone thinks of anything else, you can always reach out to us at Nami, Delaware, and we can help get connected to LaWanda or any of our other presenters. Like LaWanda mentioned, this will be is being recorded and will be up on Nami Delaware's website starting the next Monday, and then it'll be up for 30 days. So thank you so much, LaWanda, for your presentation. We always appreciate hearing from you, and we hope everyone has a great night.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for attending. This was fantastic.